You know, from that coffee you bought with the tap of your card this morning to the loan for your car, our entire world is built on promises. It's built on credit. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the legal nuts and bolts of these promises. We'll look at how they work, what gives them teeth, and what happens when they fall apart.
So let's just start with that one big question. What is a promise really worth? I mean, to you and me, it might just be a matter of honor. But in the world of law and business, the answer is super specific. And honestly, it can be the difference between getting paid or getting nothing at all.
At its very heart, credit is just a beautifully simple idea. It's the trust that lets you get something you want or need right now, all based on your promise that you're going to pay for it down the road. This single act of trust, it's the engine that makes pretty much all of modern finance possible.
Okay, so not all promises are created equal. They really fall into two different worlds. On one hand, you've got unsecured promises. These are based purely on your word, your good name. Think of a simple IOU to a friend. But then you have secured promises. This is where you don't just give your word, you actually pledge a specific piece of property as collateral to back it up. And that, right there, changes the game completely.
But what happens when your own promise, your own word, just isn't quite enough to seal the deal with the lender? Well, that's when you have to level up. You bring someone else into the picture to vouch for you.
So the first way you can do this is with something called a guarantee. A guarantor basically says to the creditor, look, I'll pay you, but only if the person you actually lent the money to is totally, completely unable to pay. Their responsibility is secondary. Think of them like a backup player who only gets on the field if the star player is literally carried off. The creditor has to go after the main debtor first.
And then we have suretyship. Now notice the tiny but incredibly powerful change in the wording. A surety promises to pay if the main debtor simply does not pay. It doesn't matter if they can't or if they just won't. If the payment doesn't happen, the surety is on the hook. You're not the backup player anymore. You're basically a co-captain. The creditor can come after either of you right from day one. This really lays out the critical difference, and you've got to get this. A guarantor is basically ensuring the debtor's ability to pay, their solvency. But a surety, they're ensuring the debt itself. Their liability is direct, it's immediate. So for anyone out there who's ever co-signed a loan, knowing which one of these you are is, well, it's everything.
Now, this brings up a really fascinating question, and it was actually the heart of a huge court case. If you agreed to be a surety for somebody today, are you on the hook for a brand new loan they decide to take out 6 months from now? A loan you might not even know about?
So here's the setup. A businessman signs something called a continuing sureship for a company, and the keyword there is continuing. The contract was written to be incredibly broad. It covered any and all debts, whether they existed right then or would pop up sometime in the future.
And here's where it gets messy. 6 months later, the company takes out another 2 million peso loan and then defaults. So the bank comes after the surety, Mr. Lim. But he says, whoa, wait a minute. I signed that agreement before this loan even existed. How can I be responsible for a future debt I never even knew about? And honestly, that sounds like a pretty reasonable argument, right?
Well, the court didn't think so. They pointed right to the law, Article 2053 of the Civil Code, which specifically says that these continuing agreements can be used to secure future debts. And the reasoning is all about making business more efficient. It lets banks give out lines of credit without having to draw up new contracts for every single little transaction. So, Lim's very broad promise had to be kept.
Okay, now we're going to raise the stakes one more time. We're moving past just personal promises and into the world of real security, where you're not just putting your name on the line, you're putting your actual physical property on the line.
So most of us have heard of a mortgage, right? You get a loan, but you get to keep living in your house while you pay it back. Well, there's this lesser-known, kind of old-school contract called antichrisis. It's totally different. In this case, the creditor actually takes possession of your property, say an apartment building you own, and uses its fruits, like the monthly rent checks, to pay down your debt. And the law is really specific about how that income from the property has to be used. It's a strict order of operations. First, you have to use it to pay the property's own expenses, like taxes. Second, it goes to pay down any interest on the loan. And only after all that is taken care of does the money finally start chipping away at the principal, the actual amount you borrowed in the first place.
This all seems pretty logical, but what happens when people try to get creative and write their own rules into a contract? What if they include a promise that's so potentially dangerous that the law itself has to step in and say, nope, you can't do that?
Take a look at this. This is an actual clause from a real court case.
The person borrowing the money agreed in writing, if I cannot pay the debt, the mortgaged property is hereby paid to you. Seems simple, right? A little harsh, maybe. If I don't pay, you just keep the property. End of story.
But it is not the end of the story. In fact, a deal like that is completely and totally forbidden by law. And there's a really, really good reason for it.
The fancy legal term for this is pactum commissarium, and what it means is that any clause that lets a creditor automatically take ownership of the collateral is illegal. Why? Well, it's to protect people who are in a tough spot. The law forces the creditor to go through a formal public foreclosure process. This makes sure the property gets sold for a fair market price, and it stops a lender from just snatching up $1 million house over a tiny $10,000 debt.
So what happens in the final showdown? You know, when a debtor just runs out of money and there are a bunch of different creditors all standing around waiting to get paid from whatever's left. Who gets their money first? Well, the law has a system for that. It's called the pecking order.
This system is called the preference of credits. It's basically the law's way of managing a financial mess when there just isn't enough money to make everyone whole. It creates a formal line, and the tough reality is not everybody gets to be at the front.
And here is maybe the most important lesson of this whole thing. Secured creditors, like a bank that has a mortgage on a house, they get first dibs. They have a special right to get paid from the money that comes from selling that specific property. That foresight they had to demand collateral, that's their ticket to the front of the line. All the unsecured creditors, they just have to wait and see if there's anything left over.
Which brings us right back to where we started. Every time you swipe a card, sign for a loan, or put your name on a contract, you're making a promise with real legal consequences. So now that you've seen how these promises work, how they're secured, and how they're enforced, how are you going to look at the next contract you sign or the next loan you think about taking?